my thought is it's worth just introducing ourselves. So I'm Steve Crofter, and I'm the Executive Director of the Community Asylum Seekers Project. And we'll just kind of go around and tell each other who we are.
I'm Evangelina Albino. I'm a CASP volunteer. Evangelina Albino, CASP volunteer.
So CASP is the acronym for the Community Asylum Seekers Project. We're just going around introducing ourselves to one another because we're such a small group. It's your turn.
You're on. I'm Peter Sears, and long time resident of Brattleboro, live on Black Mountain Road, and have been on different boards and community.
Bob Ozer. Carol and I were over at Loaves and Fishes today, and so Carol said you're doing the brown bag, so I'll come over for a little bit.
Great.
And I'm Bob Peoples. I'm a retired guidance counselor from the middle school for 28 years. And we're neighbors.
That's right.
Good morning. My name is Jim Gay. I'm actually on the board of directors with Steve here for CASP, Community Asylum Seekers Program. Came down to Steve my support.
I'm Carol Davis, and I'm a volunteer for CASP too.
I'm Richard Evers. I live here in Brattleboro. Wanted to find out what you guys are doing.
Great. Good. Well, thank you all for being here. So I wanted to tell you a little story to start off with. Back in 1980, my first wife and I moved to Brattleboro, and we had not realized that there had just recently been a resettlement of refugees from Laos here in Brattleboro at that time. But we moved into an apartment up on South Main Street and realized that the people who lived in the apartment above us never went outside to play in the snow, and they didn't speak English. And so we thought to ourselves, well, these people need some kind of welcome. So we baked a batch of chocolate chip cookies and took them upstairs and knocked on the door, and they opened the door, and we had no spoken language in common, but we smiled and nodded and bowed and gave them the cookies. Over the years, we became friends with that family, and it was a number of years later that the mom admitted to me that when we left that day, they flushed the cookies down the toilet and explained to me further that she had literally swum across the Mekong River with a baby in one arm. Somehow, please come join us anywhere. Come sit down. Sure, it's fine. She had swum across the Mekong River between Laos and Thailand with a baby in one arm, had somehow miraculously evaded the bullets of the soldiers that were trying to kill them as they crossed the river. She had spent a few years in a refugee camp, miraculously being reunited with her husband, whom she thought she would never see again, and then somehow moved halfway around the world to this strange, cold place, and had no idea if we were being very friendly or if we were trying to poison them. And there was a lot of lessons for me in that, and lessons about not making assumptions about people. But I think the biggest lesson is just that compassion is called for in this life in many, many circumstances, and that was certainly one. Fast forwarding 30-some years later, it was at a point in my retirement where I wanted to volunteer, and I knew I wanted to do something that had to do with intercultural or international relations. And I ended up going down to McAllen, Texas, and I volunteered with a Catholic Charities project that was giving short-term help to asylum seekers as they were being released from detention. And so the kind of thing that was, first thing was a welcome and a glass of water, or if the children are really dehydrated, maybe Pedialyte for the children, and a warm meal, and clean, used clothing, and a shower, a phone call. If they were staying overnight, there were cots to sleep on, although most people were leaving within a few hours to catch a bus somewhere else in the United States where they had family or friends that would welcome them. And I ended up going down 4 times over a couple of years, each time for about 10 days. And I learned a lot down there. One of the most important things I think I learned was the difference between refugees and asylum seekers. And when I went, I had no idea, I didn't know who asylum seekers were, really. But what I learned is that refugees and asylum seekers both have to meet the same legal standard of having a credible fear of returning to their home country because of persecution based on a number of possible criteria. One difference is that refugees are determined to be that way, are classified as refugees from outside of the country that they're going to end up in this case outside of the United States. And asylum seekers are people that ask for that status from within the country that they're going to end up in. So in the case of the United States, refugees come through the United Nations. The United Nations tends to classify all people en masse as qualifying as refugees. So all the people from a particular genocide or war or disaster or something will be classified as refugees. And then they'd be distributed around the world to countries willing to take them, usually after spending significant time in refugee camps. So that's, kind of the picture we have. We've all seen sort of images of refugee camps with hundreds of tents and people living there for long times. And so those are refugees. When they come to the United States, and the United States agrees with the UN to accept a certain number each year, they're distributed around the country through a number of refugee resettlement agencies. In Vermont, there's a branch of one of those agencies located up in Colchester, the Vermont Refugee Resettlement Program, and they're the ones that have settled refugees, mostly in the Burlington area, although it was big news a couple of years ago that they were trying to put Syrian families in the Rutland area, and they were able to settle a couple of families there before that got closed off to them. By contrast, asylum seekers are people that are either already in the U.S. on some kind of visa, perhaps a student visa or a work visa or a business visa. It could be any kind of way that they're here on some sort of visa, and while they're here, they tell the U.S. government that they're afraid to return to their country and need asylum to stay. The other way people will actually come, hello, welcome, please come join us, sit anywhere. People will come and to the border and request asylum, or cross the border without authorization, and then either turn themselves in to the Border Patrol or be caught and request asylum at that point. And either of those last two options, it doesn't matter whether they come legally to the border, and say, I need asylum, or whether they cross and are caught. Either way, they're treated as if they were criminals, even though it's part of international law and U.S. law that people are welcome to come and seek asylum. So the people that come to the border are put in immigration detention, which is really a euphemism for prison. Most of these detention centers, come join us, come sit anywhere. The immigration detention centers are, for the most part, run by private prison companies. So it's corporations that are making money for their shareholders by having people locked up. And the U.S. government actually guarantees a certain number of beds to be paid for every night. I can't remember if it's 34,000 or 36,000, but that's the number of beds of immigrant detention that we're paying for every night. And that's guaranteed by Congress that we'll pay that. So another difference, it's not like it's easy for someone to be a refugee, but they do arrive in the U.S. with a little tiny bit of support. There's some logistical support from those resettlement agencies that's paid for through, from the government through our taxes. And probably most importantly, refugees are allowed to work as soon as they arrive in the United States. And by contrast, asylum seekers are not allowed to work. It's a very complex formula, but basically 6 months after a particular form is filed in the, they are allowed to seek work authorization. So it turns out to be somewhere around a year, maybe a year and a half after arriving in the U.S. before they're allowed to work. So they need to rely on either their family or friends, someone they already know in the U.S. who will be willing to support them, or a church or some other organization such as the Community Asylum Seekers Project. And so when I realized that, when I was down there volunteering in Texas, you know, and all the people I was dealing with already had a place to go. They knew, you know, in most cases it was some kind of relative, cousin, husband, you know, brother or whatever, and they were headed there. But I realized that there are some people that don't have a place to go, and without that, they'll be kept in detention. And what happens then is, if they have to file their own asylum claim from prison, in many cases without any legal help, in English, without language help, the chances of them receiving asylum statistically is very close to zero. Almost universally, people who file on their own from prison are, their claims are rejected and they're deported back to their home country. And in talking with people, I talked with a man from Central America who had come to seek asylum, and he told me, yeah, he had a neighbor who had come several months previously to the U.S. to seek asylum, but he was deported, and as he had feared, he was killed within a few days of arriving back in his village. So deportation is often a death sentence, is the sad reality of it. So the other thing I learned when I was there in Texas was just that some of the stories, like the kinds of things people are running from, you know, what is the persecution that people fear? And there are a number of things. You know, in some cases it's what we think of as sort of people seeking political asylum, you know, where their political opinion doesn't jive with the government where they are, and therefore they're in danger. And, you know, there are some of those kind of cases, but it was much more likely to be people who had already lost family members because of gang violence that would target especially small businesses. So you can picture like a little mom and pop grocery store kind of thing. You know, if they don't pay protection money, if they either are not willing to pay or more likely not able to pay, they'll just start killing off family members until they either figure out how to come up with the money or leave. And you know, almost everybody that I met, you know, coming through as asylum seekers had already lost some family members. You know, in some cases, you know, I heard in gruesome detail of, you know, their children being killed or parents or whatever. Other things, as you might expect in some places, you know, being gay or lesbian is even less acceptable than it is in this country, you know, and people are targeted for extreme violence or death because of their sexual orientation. Met more than one young woman who had discovered she was on a list to be a girlfriend of a gang member. And obviously that's a euphemism for a sexual slave. And they knew that, you know, the only way to escape that was to run for their life and to get to a safe place. Another very common thing is boys and young men that are targeted to be gang members. And if they say no, they're tortured and killed. So, you know, all of those kind of reasons. And then some of the stories of what people experienced on the journey. So again, for the most part, I mean, there obviously are asylum seekers of all kinds in this world, and including people with plenty of resource, but the most common thing, obviously, you know, especially coming from places like Central America, are people without a lot of financial resource. You know, I met a man who walked with his teenage son all the way from Central America to the U.S. border. You know, it took him about a month. And he told me about his milpa, his cornfield back home, that had been passed down through the generations, you know, from a great-grandfather to his grandfather to his father to him, and how he had intended to pass it on to his son, but they instead walked through Mexico, sleeping out in other people's cornfields along the way, and he would never be able to pass it on to his son, but at least he had saved his son's life, and that's what he could hang on to. And again, he had saved his son's life, assuming that they ended with asylum. A mom who had been able to hire a coyote, someone to traffic them across the border. They were driven in a car, and they were locked into the trunk of the car, and her young boy vomited again and again because of the fumes coming into the trunk. And they got to a place where you know, she felt the car slow down, and she could hear voices outside, and the car stopped, and she was assuming they were at a border crossing, and her daughter was trying to tell her something and crying, and she clamped her hand over her daughter's mouth so that they could make it across the border. And they did make it across the border and into safety, and at least temporary safety. And when they were in detention, there were children running around playing and so on. And after a day or two, her daughter came and asked her quietly, "Mom, is it okay if I speak now?" A group of women came in one day, a group of women and children, and they had left Central America with their husbands, hired someone to get them through some mountain passes. And at some point along the way, the men had all been separated. And all of those women had no idea if their husbands were still alive or if they would someday see them again. There's no way to know, but the women and children in this case made it through. And then there was the stories of what happened when they were actually here in the United States, once they had come to the border, once they turned themselves in, once they'd been caught and put into these prisons. The first place people go, and it's common knowledge, and the word in Spanish is hilera, the icebox. And they're put into cells where the temperature is kept very cold, like down in the 40s or maybe low 50 degrees. There's no official word as to why that's done. It seems like it's done so that the word might get back that it's unpleasant here, and stay and be killed there, don't come here, we won't treat you very well. But they're kept in these they're kept in an icebox basically for usually a few days to a week. All the children we saw when I was in Texas had colds, nobody made it through there. And we understood that what people were given for sleeping was they called it aluminum, but it was really a sheet of mylar. Like we used to think of them as space blankets kind of thing. And that's what you had for protection. And so a mom would get one of those, and she would put it on the concrete floor and lie down and try and hold her children on top of her to keep them from the concrete floor that was cold. And again, often if people had just crossed the river, they might be in wet clothing and conditions. After the ice box, usually people graduated to the kennel, which was still cages, but at least the temperature was normal room temperature or hotter, but they were no longer freezing. And then eventually, if people were kept in long enough, they would be put into a more humane kind of prison where there were places for children to play, or actual school for children, and perhaps even English lessons, and if they were lucky, access to pro bono legal counsel, maybe a paralegal that would come in and try and help a number of people by talking about what their rights were and so on. I talked to one, when I was there, I talked to one boy who was 11, and I asked him, so when he was there with his mom, and I asked him, when you were there in the prison with your mom, I assume like you got to play with the other children? And he said, no. And I said, oh, I don't understand, like were you and your mom were just in in a cell by yourself? And he said, no. And I still didn't understand. And I asked him, and he said, no. He said, I was in a cell by myself for the week that we were there in prison. And I hadn't imagined that we kept 11-year-olds in solitary confinement. But that's what I found out. So again, it's U.S. law that people, and international law, that people have a right to come and seek asylum when they need it. And it's discouraging to know that we as a nation mistreat people so when they are doing what is their legal right to do. And not just a legal right, but obviously, a human right to seek safety. But as I said, I began to get the idea, like, okay, these people have a place to go once they got to this Catholic Charities Project. They got a bus ticket, they're going somewhere. But what about the other people that don't have a place to go? And there were attorneys there at this project giving advice to people. And so I asked the question a number of times and did get the sense that many times asylum seekers in prison would be eligible for release at some point if they had someone that would offer them a place to go. And as much as I got out of going on these trips to Texas, I realized that there was the possibility of welcoming people here, that I could stay in Vermont and help people up this way. And so I got together with, some neighbors and friends, and basically we decided to start a nonprofit organization, which we did. We got the 501c3 status, and we, formed the nonprofit corporation under the laws of Vermont, and began to try and figure out how to network to locate people. And it took a number of months to kind of figure things out, but we made enough different contacts around the country with different kinds of groups. In some cases, there were like legal teams working with asylum seekers, or in many cases, it's groups of volunteers who live near a particular immigration detention center and volunteer to go in and visit immigrants in prison, basically. And so they were in a position to sometimes know, oh, so-and-so has been here a while, and we understand from the ICE officials that they would be eligible to go, but they don't have a place to go. They don't have any family or friends. And so gradually we sort of figured out that aspect of it, how to actually get people released if they were eligible. And then we also figured, okay, so what's our model going to be? Where are we going to put these people who have no legal right to work, can't earn their own way? So we sort of got the idea of hosting people just in willing hosts' homes. So we now have 4 different families, 2 here in Brattleboro, 1 in Westminster, and 1 up in Rockingham. And we actually have a 5th family literally going to arrive any day now and going to be living up in Marlborough. And in all these cases, it's individual, local people who have said, we'll share our home for a while or whatever it takes to give these folks a place to stay. And then lots of other people, many people have donated money to support that because, again, we're buying food for people to eat, we're helping with their transportation, all different kinds of needs, getting them clothing, etc. And then there's just been many people who have stepped forward to volunteer in lots of capacities. Several of you here now are volunteers. And everything from volunteering to host someone, to interpreting, to helping them find clothing, or getting them, arranging for their medical care, or being a driver when they need to go to an appointment, or helping being a liaison with the school system, or many things. We have volunteers that help behind the scenes with things like helping us fundraise, when we sell baked goods down at the Welcome Center, helping bake those things. And some people are way far afield and help with things like maybe not even directly with the asylum seekers that we're hosting, but people have volunteered to be pen pals with asylum seekers in detention. Or there's some steps along the way. Each asylum seeker initially has to pass what's called a credible fear interview. And those are the government provides interpretation for those, but it's also okay for us to provide someone to listen in by telephone with these interviews, and especially someone who knows the native language that's being used, as well as English, might catch something that's misinterpreted and could request that the officer, ask that question again, or notice some kind of irregularity and make note of that for the attorney that will ultimately take the case. There's a lot of different ways people can volunteer. And before you go, I hope there's a clipboard over there. In fact, maybe Carol, you'd be willing to just sort of pass the clipboard around. If you're not already on our list, please feel free to sign up, and what that'll get you will be an occasional email and of what sort of latest news, and we'll also contact you to just ask you to go to our website, or you can do this anyway. Go to our website where there's a lot of the volunteer opportunities are spelled out there, and you can sort of see lots of ways to be involved. So, so we always need money. We figure it takes approximately $10,000 a year to support each family. And so we need money to do that, and we need more volunteers to take care of them. If we have the money to invite them, then we need to show up and do all the jobs that need doing. And probably the hardest thing to find is people willing to share their homes. And understandably, it's a big ask, but it's also, as you can imagine, is also rewarding. My partner and I have had a mom and 2 children living with us since October of 2017, so a little over a year and a half now. And, not that it hasn't had its trying moments, but it's also been extremely rewarding to have that with us. And I want to tell you a couple stories about that person. I'm going to call her Rosa, the mom that's living with us. So going back to when she was still in detention, so this would have been early October 2017, she had actually, when she came to the U.S., she actually came not determined that she was ready to seek asylum, but she wanted to find out more about it. She'd heard about asylum, and she came to the border to ask. And as soon as she asked, she was, all of a sudden, she was there, her children, they were being, I think the children weren't strict searched, but she was, and just 12 hours later, it was too late to back out of just asking about asylum. She was in the system. And soon thereafter, in the icebox. It was their misfortune to be in the icebox with a family that had a baby in diapers, but there were no diapers provided. And so, the mom of that baby was trying to wash out the paper diaper, and obviously it didn't work anymore, and there were feces and urine on the floor where they all slept for 3 days in that situation. But eventually they were in the better prison, and the children were happy. They actually, instead of, initially what they got to eat 3 meals a day was ramen noodles, 3 meals a day. But eventually the children got pizza, and they were much happier, and they actually got to go to school, which they liked, and there was the playground. It was much better, although they were still not free. They'd come to seek asylum, and instead they were in prison. But she had brought with her a telephone number of a relative whom they were hoping would be able to help them. And after they'd been there, she'd passed the credible fear interview, and they were, well along in this system. One of the ICE officials called her, as well as a number of the other moms, into a meeting, and kind of, and when they all came in, gave them a government pamphlet from the Department of Homeland Security pamphlet about, basically how the asylum process works and what your rights are, what your responsibilities are. And on the cover of this little trifold pamphlet was a picture of the Statue of Liberty. And so they each got one of these. And then Rosa was over on one side of the room, but the official kind of went around the room talking to each person in turn and explaining, yes, we've contacted your cousin, and here's the deal. You know, we'll get you another phone call with that person. They can get tickets, you know, and on Monday you'll be released, et cetera. And so talking to each person in turn. And then finally, except for Rosa, and then finally it was time. And she said, well, okay, everybody but Rosa, I'd like you to stay for a minute. And everyone else, now you have your instructions and you can leave. And then, you know, Rosa didn't know what's happening, but the woman says to her, you know, we've not been able to contact your cousin, whatever it was, your relative. There's been no answer. You know, do you know anyone else? You know, do you have any other relatives or friends in the U.S.? And, no, I don't know anyone else. You know, the official said, well, without someone that will take you in, you know, we can't release you. And Rosa holds up the pamphlet and points to the Statue of Liberty and says, maybe she will take me in, you know. And to realize that somebody who's been that mistreated has that much faith in our national values of welcoming strangers, of welcoming immigrants to our land, is very moving to me. But of course the official said, well, the Statue of Liberty can't take you in. But she said, I do have this one other slight possibility that I don't know much about, but we've just heard that there's a little organization way off in the little state of Vermont that maybe has a place for people. And we can try that and contact them. And so we got contacted to see if we had a space for this mom and 2 children, and we did at that point. And so one nice ending to that particular story is that a year ago during April school vacation, we all went down to New York City for a few days, slept on the floor, on a clean floor with friends of ours, and we got to ride the Staten Island ferry and see the Statue of Liberty and stuff. So it had continued to have significant meaning for her. The other little story I want to tell about Rosa is that something that happened fairly soon after they had arrived. So the office for the Community Asylum Seekers Project is just in my home, you know, just off the living room, which is connected to the kitchen, and that's where I do this work. And often what I do involves being in touch with, again, I talked about this sort of network of groups around the country. And it's not one direction, it's also people contacting us to see if we have a place for someone. And almost always we don't. You know, it's very rare that, you know, if we have a place, we go looking. We don't usually have a place for someone. But as you can imagine, it's always poignant to hear about someone who needs a place, and we can't, you know, once again, we can't help them. But I hear their story, I hear what their need is. I hear how hard whoever this is on the other end of the phone is working to help them, you know, and we're probably the 20th place they've tried, but we also are saying no. So it's always a hard thing. And when I get off the phone or finish with the email communication, whatever it is, I'll often come out to the kitchen where I look for my partner Laurel and take a few minutes to cry about this latest sorrow kind of thing. And so in this particular case, I've just learned about a family from Nigeria, a dad and a mom. I guess the mom and children were already out, but the dad would be eligible for release if the family had a secure place to go. So it's a dad and a mom, 4 children, another one on the way from Nigeria, and you know, who's going to take a family of 7. and we didn't have, we didn't even have a place for anybody at that point. So Rosa, who's living in this, it's hard to explain. We have an outbuilding that we renovated a part of, so it's got a bedroom that's smaller than this little square with this green around it here, a tiny bathroom, and a living room about the size of this. No kitchen. They eat in the farmhouse with us in our kitchen. And again, that, she was obviously very grateful for what she was given, but it wasn't much. But after this call, I come out to the kitchen expecting to find Laurel, but Laurel and Rosa are sitting there at the table talking, and so instead of telling Laurel in English, as I would usually do, I explained in Spanish about this family from Nigeria and how many there were, and I'm crying because there's no way we can help them. And without missing a beat, Rosa said, well, my children and I can stay in the bedroom and they can have the living room. Without having our cultural sense of entitlement and how much space each of us needs, and how reluctant we are to really share. The point just came home to me, like, how much resource do we need to be able to share with others? So I kind of leave you with that, and am open to any ideas or questions or whatever you'd like to talk about, ask about. One particular need, I really do hope you'll all consider signing up as volunteers, consider donating money. There is a donation jar there if you're inclined today. One need that we may have starting June 1st, we have two men, twin brothers actually from Cuba. They're in their 30s, and they're in a home here in Brattleboro, but they will need to move at the beginning of June. And one of them is eligible for work now, the other is not. But the one who's working looks like he's getting a job that's going to actually enable them to pay rent very soon, but we're not sure that they're going to be able to pay by June 1st, kind of thing. And we don't have the kind of money, we have enough money to help people with the little things, the food, et cetera. We don't have enough money to rent an apartment. So if any of you are inclined or could think of someone that might be willing to share a home or just some kind of situation, it would probably be pretty temporary, like maybe 1 or possibly 2 months, but we're not talking years here, just to give these guys a little bit of breathing room so they can get together enough money to rent their own place. So that's, but glad to open up to questions and consider.
How long did it take to get him qualified to work?
So it's 6 months after submitting a particular form, but that's something that we make sure that each of our guests gets a qualified immigration attorney. And so far we've been lucky enough to be able to get pro bono attorneys, but we have one attorney here in Brattleboro. We have an attorney up that we use and can use for a couple cases up at Vermont Law School up in South Royalton. We've got a law firm in Boston that's taken the case. But where I'm going with that is that if somebody arrives and most cases are not going to be very far along in their asylum case, like basically just beginning. And so it takes a while to get an attorney to accept their case, have time to meet with them, and then do all the interviewing and getting them to tell their story enough to really flesh it out, to be able to submit the form that has at least the outline of their case. And it's 6 months from that time, and that probably takes several months at a minimum. So basically, for someone to get to the point of submitting that form, usually it's a matter of months, and then 6 months later before they can work. But in this particular case, one of these brothers can work and at this point the other one not.
Well, Vermont has passed a law that unidentified or undocumented people can work on farms and not be harassed or targeted.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear the beginning.
In Vermont,
Uh-huh.
unregistered,
Yeah, undocumented.
undocumented
Right.
people are not supposed to be targeted.
They're not supposed to be targeted, but they still are, I mean,
She's saying farm
th-
workers.
yeah, but they're not immune from being picked up and deported.
But they're not supposed to be identified because they look up like they're different.
Right, exactly, right,
Vermont has made that clear.
right.
Because they,
And
and so
most of the
I'm
time that
confused how they get an undocumented person who just comes in here through an airport or something.
Mhm.
And they still can work in Vermont, and then they go home. They're working in our factories. So how does that work?
Well,
It's a different process.
huh?
It's a different.
It's a different process,
It's a
it's not
different
asylum,
process.
Yeah,
it's not
this is
asylum
a-
seekers. And the reality,
Not asylum seekers.
yeah,
They're not asylum
they're
seekers.
right,
No,
I
but-
mean, I suppose someone might be both,
So-
but that's not likely.
So they get through customs how?
Well, they might cross the border illegally, just, to cross when no one's looking, or be here on some kind of visa and then stay after the
Oh,
visa
they're on a
expires.
visa. Okay.
It could be
Work
a number of
visa
different.
Yeah,
for farm work.
so that's how
Right,
they got it.
Right. The trouble,
I'm
and part
sorry,
of,
I just-
No,
yeah,
it's
no,
very
a great,
confusing.
it's a great question. And part of the problem is there's visa programs for seasonal agricultural
Yes,
workers
I
in this
know.
country. Yeah, so people that come to harvest a particular fruit or
Okay.
something like that.
So that's-
Unfortunately, dairy workers are not seasonal. You've got to milk the cows year-round. And there's no provision, there's no legal provision for people coming on visas to stay,
Year-round.
throughout the year, year-round to work on a dairy farm. So that's it, yeah.
How do you qualify to be a host for a family, and what kind of support do you get? And how does
Right.
the language barrier
Right.
be overcome?
Right, okay, great questions. So first of all, I'm going to divide that question into two parts, because where I thought you were going is what's required from the government? And the answer is virtually nothing. We could be human traffickers, sex perverts, whatever. Nobody in the government is sort of saying, oh, CASP, can you prove to us that you're a safe place for these people to live? It's more if we say we'll take care of them and get them to their court hearings, that's all the government cares about. And there's absolutely no oversight of what we're doing from the government. But that being said, internally within our organization, we do want to make sure that that our guests are safe. So we do require that any of our volunteers who will work alone, will be in a situation alone with any of our guests, we have a background check kind of thing. We haven't yet begun, it's our intention to eventually really have a formal training program, and we haven't gotten that together yet, but we do have sort of informal training, and we've got a lot of qualified people who have, good intercultural skills or good mental health skills, and we also work in teams so that around each guest family, like if you were going to host someone at your home, we would not just want to say, okay, here they are, good luck, you're on your own, but to really establish and make sure we had a team designed to work well together, someone giving oversight of that team, making sure that we have sufficient interpreters, assuming that the language that the guests speak is not English, to have interpreters in that language available for communication. We would, look at the guests, look at the host home to make sure that it's, a safe place, that there's, it doesn't have to be a lot of space, it doesn't have to be fancy, but that it's, basically safe and adequate. And so kind of in all of those ways, we just sort of, we do have our own sort of quality control program, basically, to make sure it happens. And in terms of what kind of support, in terms of monetary support, assuming if a host needs it, we're stand ready to kind of reimburse sort of the increase in like utility costs. And that's tended to be about $50 a month in most cases where hosts have requested that. And some hosts have said, no, I don't need that. I'm glad to just donate that. So that can kind of go either way. And our assumption is that we would not expect the host to cover expenses like food or personal spending money. So we give each guest a stipend each month for sort of personal expenses, haircut, toiletries, and just that kind of thing. And then also food. Some of our guests we found are eligible for Free Square, the Vermont food stamp program, but mostly they're not. But again, if they're eligible for that, then we will help them apply. And if they're getting that assistance, then we can save the food money that we would otherwise give them.
Do you have any children, and are they in school?
Yeah, we have, two of the families have children. So we have a girl in 5th grade in one family, and in another family, a boy in 4th grade and a girl in 1st grade in schools in Westminster and in Rockingham. And in both cases, they've been really warmly received by the school system. Welcome.
Does the host family arrange that with the school, or does the...
No, that's an example of something it partly would depend on how active the hosts want to be, and there's really a range. And in one case, we've actually got hosts, someone that was willing to share their home, but they weren't going to be here all winter, and that's the case with the men that need to move on in June. The people that own that home are coming back at the beginning of June. So they were willing to just have their space used all winter without them being home. In another case, we had a host family, mom and dad and 2 children, who said, we are very glad to welcome someone. We have a spare room. They're welcome to, eat. We're hardly ever home. We don't tend to be home in the evenings, but they can use our kitchen. They're welcome to live here. We have absolutely no time to put into them. And so in that case, it was really clear, we as an organization are going to have to provide a strong enough volunteer team that we're not relying on the host to provide anything other than the physical space. And in reality, they've become good friends. They do occasionally eat together. They're teaching the guests English, and the guests are teaching them Spanish, and they play with the children, and there's a lot of good stuff happening with that family. But they've made it really clear we're not here to sign up as volunteers other than to be hosts. Minimal. They're not going to arrange a doctor's appointment or something like that. We have other volunteers to do that. And then I can think of a host that likes to take all that stuff on and has done virtually everything himself because he wanted to. And so it really can run the gamut. Yeah.
See, the way you describe it, the compared to the problem, the solution at the moment is still tiny.
Right.
It's and it's being met at the grassroots level by little nuclear groups like your own, of people of compassion and goodwill who want to do something. But why isn't there a response at a greater scale? Why aren't the humanitarian organizations, which know how to swing into action on a lot of issues, the major religious groups, why hasn't there been a bigger response of compassion?
Yeah. Well, there are some national organizations that are working to end immigrant detention, that are working to encourage this kind of thing, that are, encouraging facilitating networking around the country and so on. But it is limited compared to the problem. But I think part of the answer is that it's lucrative to keep people in prison.
Yeah.
That's a big part of it. And so there's no financial incentive for capitalism to end this problem.
Right.
That's a big piece of it.
Prisons.
Yeah,
And,
yeah.
This is what I wanted to add.
Sure. Go ahead.
Okay.
Yeah, go.
From my perspective, and I think this was an issue for me with the article that came out about the CASP project on Thursday at the Reformer, if anybody saw it.
Right.
And I think the humanitarian part, the compassionate part is one part, but I think there's a political part.
Right.
And that's what I think is difficult to access. You know, is the power and the power and the economy together. And I think humanitarianly people are doing things,
Right.
but it's taking on the power issue. That's very hard. And I don't think people want to take it on. There's xenophobia, there's ethnocentrism, there's racism. I mean, it's.
When you said that the prison is a money-making thing, I hadn't even thought of that. So you're talking about contractors that are working for the government, and that's where the money is.
Right.
So it just impedes and it continues the imprisonment.
And a lot of them, besides the private prisons, there's many places around the country or where, you know, municipalities, so it's cities, counties, whatever, also contract with ICE to use the
Jobs.
county jail. So for example, yeah, it's jobs and it's rent on the,
Rent, right.
you know, they get rent for that. So from northern New England, all ICE detainees go to the Stratford County Prison in Rochester or Dover, New Hampshire. That's where, so people from Vermont that are arrested go there, and it's a county jail that gets paid for that.
Convoluted question.
Sure.
So, and whether this is true or not, I don't know. But apparently this morning there was a news article that was based upon sources. And the sources said that that Homeland Security is thinking of training agents to conduct credible fear interviews earlier in the process. Okay. And that could happen, you know, maybe at point of entry or very soon thereafter. So I guess there's two questions here. One, if that's true,
Right.
do you think that's a good thing or a bad thing? And number two, if that does happen, does that lay open another possibility of connecting folks who can do interpretive work earlier in the process with these trained agents?
Right.
It's apparently going to take a while to train the agents to do the interviews.
Maybe they're stepping that up to have more agents trained to do that.
Yeah. And then maybe just a heads up if that,
Right.
you know, to find
Yeah.
out if that's true or not.
Yeah, I hadn't heard, I wasn't aware of that, but I think it's probably a good thing. As you can imagine, we've heard stories of, you know, very compassionate officials running those interviews and people that were totally unfair. You know, it's, as in anything else, you know, you're going to find both kinds.
Are they still refusing to allow gang violence and domestic violence as a reason for credible fear?
I think it's,
What happened with that?
I think that's gotten challenged enough, and the other thing is that the cases take so long that, and just because there's some policy, it doesn't necessarily get followed at the court level. When I hear like news of, you know, the latest thing that comes out of the Justice Department or something, I don't get too worked up about it because it always gets challenged, it always gets changed. It's the latest thing to upset us, and by the time someone's case actually gets there, it's probably 2 years down the road anyway. And, you know, it's hard to know the answer to that. So-
Because one of the things I think they talked about doing was making it mandatory to let people, only keep people incarcerated for a smaller number of days, which if they do the credible interview
Sooner they can.
sooner, then people will be reported sooner, or, right? Yeah.
Or like, right,
I mean,
yeah,
they don't have a
yeah,
place
yeah.
to go.
It should be a good thing if they can speed that process up. Definitely.
No, it won't be, because then
They'll
they'll be
have to go
deported.
back home.
Well, that's the ones that will be deported, but the ones that are, they will have to spend as long in prison.
But there are many stories of them not knowing what they were signing, so when they were asked about leaving their children,
Right.
they thought they were going to get their children back, and they did not. And so they are not interpreting
Right.
a lot of this to these women or parents of young children. And there's no, the news is not giving us any access to, well, what you're doing, for instance, or any kind of an organization of groups that would help. If we're watching national news, which is a lot of facts,
Right.
we're not getting educated as to how we can help now,
Right.
except for what you've just done
Right.
today.
That's true. I got excited when recently when the administration said that we're going to send all undocumented people to sanctuary cities and states and so on. And I was, I think there's a lot of places that would say, great, bring them on. But it also, like, if we were interested as a country in saving money and being more humane, we could definitely reduce the number of people imprisoned and the length of time people are there by encouraging groups like this, communities, churches, neighborhoods, whatever, around the country to host asylum seekers. Canada tried this a couple of years ago with refugees, where instead of only doing it through agencies, they allowed individual Canadian families to voluntarily host refugees for a year. And I'm not sure what the outcome of that experiment was, but
I remember our church helped Vietnam refugee families, and we set them up in an apartment.
Right.
They got jobs.
Yeah.
Our church, after World War II,
Yeah.
took in families, and they remained in our life in Iowa their whole life. So that's called refugee. But you say that is done to the United Nations or something that way.
Right.
So it works much better that way.
Right. And definitely, church groups were a mainstay of the volunteer force that, that helped resettle refugees here in Brattleboro and, many places.
Yeah, so the refugee status is
So, other questions? Yeah.
The Episcopal Church, which I go to, is a very progressive church, and I would love to see you come in and give a little talk. They have people from organizations that come in during the service and make presentations or before the service. You would get a good response.
Yeah, I have been there. Oh, you're talking about it here at St. Michael's Episcopal?
Yeah.
I have been there.
And there's a lot of volunteers from there.
Right, there are.
Oh, you
In
are?
CASP,
Yeah.
yes. How about
What is your price?
All souls as well.
Yeah, we were connected.
All souls.
Yeah, the Guilford Community Church has also been very supportive. One difference there is that Lisa is so involved, Lisa Sparrow is so involved with her project in Africa that we've agreed to, we don't want to take away the church's support of that away. And she's very, very careful to not try and take support away from us. So, a lot of respect, but again, Guilford Community Church has a related project, a related but very different project that's, focused there.
So is All Souls approached you?
We've done a lot with All Souls. They've done a number of fundraising activities for us. Again, we have volunteers from All Souls.
I feel like the churches themselves should have a little bit of spare room, too.
Right, yeah, that's occurred to us.
Anybody, well, not to provide sanctuary, which some of them are doing, right? But just to be like a host place.
Right, yeah. Yeah, no, it's true. A lot of churches,
Maybe they don't
might
realize
have
how
it.
many volunteers there are that would
Right, that would be good.
facilitate.
Oh, you mean living in that
In the
building?
church, like, there must be.
Right, there are churches that might have a place,
Yeah, like a little
suitable
room.
to stay, a little room.
Small rooms.
And often there's a church
Bathroom.
kitchen anyway. That's true. We've got one thing that we're doing that's different with this family that's about to come is that, to Marlborough, is that during the academic year, they're going to physically stay at Marlborough College and eat in the college dining hall and stuff.
That's nice.
And then when college is not in session, they're going to be in a post home in the townspeople, are forming a support team around them.
What's the family composition?
The family composition in Marlborough is 2 women
And where are they from?
from Honduras.
So how does the matching occur between the people who do come to your attention and you're able to help?
Right, so if we have a willing host home, and so that we're ready to accept someone. And, I mean, there may be a time when, like if we're welcoming new people next week, I don't want to take another family next week too, but, we space them out a little bit just so that we have the time and attention to pay to people. But assuming we're ready to accept someone and you were going to host, we would find out, do you have age, gender, language preferences? Are you okay with children, not with children, et cetera. So that, certainly what the host's feelings would be paramount in figuring somebody. So we want somebody compatible in your home. And then, so far we've always been able to have, it's been pretty minimal, but some kind of interview. So we can usually find out a lot about somebody from the pro bono legal team or the volunteer team or whatever. And, we've always been able to have, at least a 15-minute phone call with somebody with an interpreter if needed, to ask them, we've already passed on information through the team, through the legal team or the volunteers or whatever. We passed on information about our organization, about the host home. If it was your home, we would have hopefully been able to send some photos. In one case, we actually made a little video of the host home.
So what's
so
the
they
change?
know a little bit, and then you would also get a chance to know a little bit about them. But the decision gets made without, you don't get a chance to meet them because we're gonna fly them in from across the country, or something like that.
So you're probably talking to a legal representative, a pro bono legal representative
Right.
for
Most
them,
cases, yeah.
who's organized themselves around
Right.
the issue.
Yeah.
They are talking to whom?
They are
They are talking to the
to the
authorities. They,
yes, in most cases, they would both be in touch with the individual asylum seeker and the authorities.
And they are, who are they?
Well, it could be, so some examples of who it might be. It might be someone on a volunteer team who visits people in prisons.
And how do you find them?
Through the networking we've done. I mean, we're in touch with 50 such groups around the country. It might be a legal team that volunteers at a prison. In most cases, it's that.
so and those 50 groups are working to get these people out of
Or to assist them
custody.
while they're there, to
Yeah,
give them comfort
and find them a placement. And so they're the ones, that's
Right.
where the rubbing edge with authority is
Right.
between these
Right.
groups
Right. Yep.
and whoever's holding them. Yeah.
Right.
Is there any chance that our representatives are ever going to make it possible for us to be rather not nebulous, but to have a place
Well,
to call
all
what they are?
of our state representatives, our senators and
No,
representatives, both at federal and state level, are very supportive of what we're doing.
Well, I know,
But they also don't
we're
have.
talking about a nebulous 50
What
group.
they may be needing.
There's no organization because we're not tied to the United Nations.
Yeah.
So,
And the United
how
Nations
do you-
doesn't have.
well,
Yeah, you don't have a
when they
conversation.
bring refugees over, they're
that's
tied
fine.
to something. when they come.
Yeah.
So why can't we get
You
tied
know where I
to
live.
Good to see you again. Thank you so much.
Can I reach you at this number? Is that,
Yes, you can.
you live in Chester?
In Rockingham, but the mailing address is.
I'm sorry.
But yes. Good to see you. Thanks. Yeah. So, yeah, it'd be great to get it more, good ideas that you folks are putting out about how to try and tie it all together so that it can be more organized, so that more groups around the country will be inspired to do this. That'd be great. So,
give you a lot of money?
yeah.
Thank you, Steve.
Yeah, thank you all for being here. And good to see you. Thank you for filming.
ECTV.
Seeing you everywhere.
You have lots of names.
I keep running into you.
Were you part of it? I can't remember what it's called, but a group of people that get together for dinner.
Is this the best way we can grow our big orchard? Is this the best way we can grow our food?